lecturer in discipline here on behalf of Harriman Institute. And this is a panel that is co-organized by Harriman Institute and the Weatherhead Center, the Weatherhead Institute at Columbia University. And I would like to thank the Weatherhead Institute for their cooperation in our goal of expanding knowledge of Russia to new audiences and to expanding the discussion of less central regions of the world to Russian foreign policy. In other words, we often have discussions about Russian-European, Russian-US relations. And here we want to bring in discussion of, from the point of view of Russian studies, somewhat understudied parts of the world. And so we are very pleased to have three specialists for our panelists today: Greg Brzezinski, Elizabeth Wishnick, and Jenny Town. And before I turn it over to our speakers, I would like to just say a few words about the format. Each of our speakers will speak for about 15 minutes. And after the presentations, we will move to a question and answer period. And if you have a question and you are watching on the Zoom webinar format, please place your questions in the Q&A. And if you are joining us on YouTube, please place your questions in the chat box. And I will read the questions to our speakers, and we'll go from there for a discussion. The entire event will last about an hour and 15 minutes to an hour and a half. And we will definitely stop by 1:30 if you want to make plans for the rest of your afternoon. So this is an extraordinary time in international politics. Events are coming faster than we can really make sense of them or even digest them. And this panel and our series here is designed to help bring much needed historical and contextual perspective to recent events in the world. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is Greg Brzezinski, a professor of history and international affairs at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. His publications include Nation Building in South Korea, Koreans, Americans, and the Making of a Democracy, and also Winning the Third World, Sino-American Rivalry During the Cold War. Greg is also director of the Asian Studies program at GW. With that, I would like to ask Greg to begin his presentation. Greg?
Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank Elise, Eileen, as well as the Harriman Institute and the Weatherhead Institute. It's great to be here, and I think as a historian, my job today is to kind of provide historical context for the current Russia-North Korea relationship. I think, obviously, if you look at things today, Russia and North Korea probably are closer than they have been at any time that I could really think of since the 1990s. Now, I know my name is Brzezinski, so a lot of people think he must speak Russian, but actually that's not the case. My languages are Korean and Mandarin, and so I tend to read the North Korean propaganda and articles more than I could read the Russian propaganda. But what I see in North Korean newspapers and journals is just a bevy of articles that are tooting the new relationship with Russia. And of course, Russia has taken some actions in the UN that limit the effectiveness of sanctions. This has been very much to the pleasure of the North Korean government. But the question, of course, that this raises is how long will this newfound friendship between Russia and North Korea last? How long will this close relationship between them last? And I think history really suggests that there might be some limits to it, and it's not going to last very long. I think Russia and North Korea have never really been very compatible economically, politically, culturally as partners, aside from when they have been able to help each other with urgent geostrategic interests. And so this is why I think closeness between North Korea and Russia has tended to wax and wane over the years and will in all likelihood continue to do so. In the past, every time that North Korea and Russia or the Soviet Union moved closer together, it never lasted very long. And there were two key reasons for this. First, Russia often alienated North Korea either through its inept diplomacy or through sudden changes in its ideology or policy. And second, because China has always been a more natural partner for North Korea economically, politically, and culturally. So the Soviet-North Korean relationship has always been dependent in part on China's maneuvering. So I think, if you go back historically, the Soviet Union was, of course, deeply involved in the process of state formation in North Korea. It helped to install Kim Il-sung into a position of leadership and assure that a socialist regime came to power in Northern Korea after World War II. And the Soviet Union, Soviet forces occupied North Korea during the years between 1945 and 1948 as part of agreements that had been worked out at the end of World War II. But I think this is sort of an interesting situation because even while the North Korean leaders were deeply indebted to the Soviets, and if you look at the Soviet occupation policy, they had a lighter overall footprint than the U.S. military occupation of South Korea did. But it certainly wasn't the case that North Koreans were eager to have the Russian occupation. The nationalism was a powerful force at the time, and so many North Koreans wanted the occupation to end as soon as possible. Moreover, even before the Korean War, and even though North Korea continued to seek weapons from the Soviets, the political and cultural influence of Mao Zedong and the Chinese communists started to grow stronger and stronger vis-a-vis that of the Soviet Union. Similarly, while Stalin had helped to plan out the invasion of South Korea with Kim Il-sung in 1950, the Korean War had demonstrated that China shared more in common with North Korea strategically than the Soviet Union did. And, Stalin had initially been reluctant to support a North Korea invasion of the South Korea, and he certainly didn't want to send forces into the Korean theater, as China eventually did. So for Stalin, a victory for communism on the Korean Peninsula was desirable, but it never received the same kind of it never received a higher priority than Europe. After the Korean War, there actually was this period in the communist world in which the communist powers got along very well. There was this period of a sort of entente after the Korean War. And I apologize. I have a dog who's misbehaving, but I'm just going to.
Yeah, I don't think we can even hear your dog, actually.
Yes, I know she's
Oh, she's jumping up.
Yeah, she's being mischievous. I apologize. I knew that was going to happen. But anyway, let me go back to things. I do apologize for that. I want to talk about so there's this period after the Korean War where the Soviets, the Chinese, and the North Koreans are all getting along very well, but it doesn't last long. And this is sort of the theme that I was talking about with the Soviet Union sort of changing ideologies, because you eventually get Khrushchev's secret speech of 1956. And when you get this, after you get this speech, he calls for de-Stalinization. He calls for the abandonment of cults of personality and some other aspects of socialism that Stalin had introduced. Kim Il-sung was willing to embrace Khrushchev's new vision of wasn't willing to embrace Khrushchev's new vision of socialism. The KWP itself was divided at that time into what some historians have called factions. And so what happens is that Kim Il-sung begins purging members of the party whose criticisms of him echoed those that had been made by Khrushchev. And the Soviets responded to this by organizing a famous mission in which they sent Anastas Mikoyan and Peng Dehuai to North Korea. And what they did during this visit was they pressured Kim Il-sung to stop carrying out these purges. North Korea itself was sort of, politically divided, and there was more dissent allowed in North Korea during the 1950s than there would be by the 1970s. But this intervention itself created a lot of mistrust between the Soviet Union and North Korea. And there was also lingering political disagreements. Again, North Korea stuck to this idea of a cult of personality, whereas the Soviet Union condemned it. And so there was this growing alienation between North Korea and the Soviet Union. Then you get into the 1960s, and the relationship between the Soviet Union and North Korea starts to become even more difficult and problematic. One of the key issues, of course, would be the Sino-Soviet split, which starts to ramp up during the 1950s, the late 1950s, and by the early 1960s, it's become very open and public. And so as a result of the Sino-Soviet split, North Korea doesn't want to take sides too blatantly, but to the extent that it takes sides at all, it moves closer to China, again, because it feels culturally, politically closer to China than it does to the Soviet Union. Now, that doesn't mean that was the end of ties between Russia and North Korea, but every time they moved closer, they would eventually end up moving further apart. One time that they start to move closer together is during the late 1960s, during the Cultural Revolution, when China starts to become more isolated and its foreign policy starts to alienate even its closer allies, and North Korea doesn't know who to turn to at this point. And so it's able to, the Soviets are able to briefly improve their relationship with North Korea. But nevertheless, by the 1970s, North Korea once again seemed to be moving closer to China, and competition between China and the Soviet Union persisted. By the 1980s, the situation changed once again. One aspect of the 1980s was that South Korea's economy was racing ahead of North Korea's, and this created new challenges for North Korea. And so there's actually yet again during the mid-1980s another period in which the Soviet Union and North Korea move closer together again. But once again, as it had been the case during the 1950s, during the 1980s, this movement closer together between the Soviet Union and North Korea didn't last very long. There were several factors that drove North Korea and Russia together during the 1980s. One of them was that with South Korea improving its own defense industry. North Korea desperately wanted to buy weapons. The other aspect was there was this perception at the time, again, that China was moving too close to the United States. Most of the socialist camp boycotted the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles, but China decided to participate. And so North Korea was worried about that. And so once again, they sort of turned to the Soviet Union. Military sales and military aid to North Korea increased during the 1980s. But why does this eventually collapse? It collapses for a number of reasons. One of these reasons is that, during the late 1980s, the Soviet Union is being courted by South Korea. South Korea is pursuing this policy of Nordpolitik, in which it tries to improve its relations with the countries of the communist bloc, and it's effective. But North Korea was doing everything it could to try to sabotage this. And so increasingly, the Soviet Union didn't view North Korea as a potential ally, but as sort of a nuisance that was blocking it from improving relations with South Korea. Then the Soviet Union did two things that completely wrecked the relationship with North Korea. One, the more minor sin, was agreeing to participate in the 1988 Olympics in Seoul. The major sin, of course, was the decision to normalize relations with South Korea in 1990. And those two things really hurt, the North Korean regime and hurt its, sense of legitimacy. After the Soviet Union collapses, of course, Russia itself starts seeking economic aid. So the last thing it's going to do is offer aid to North Korea. And so since then, I think for much of the next 30 years, relations between Russia and North Korea were at best pragmatic and at worst hostile. For instance, Russia often supported UN Security Council sanctions on North Korea, even though it sometimes even though it sometimes worked with China to weaken them. But, Russia generally had different interests than North Korea for most of the 1990s and the early part of the 21st century. It didn't want to see North Korea destabilize the international environment through brinkmanship or nuclear tests. As Russia's economy recovered, it gave some marginal aid to North Korea, but it was really China that determined North Korea's economy and diplomacy much more significantly. So now, just from my view as a historian, we once again have Russia and North Korea being brought together by a sort of perfect storm of common interests, international efforts to isolate both countries, China being generally supportive and permissive of closer Russian-North Korean ties. And so all of these things have brought Russia and North Korea back together for, some very specific purposes. And I'll leave it to the other speakers to talk about, North Korean weapon sales and the military relationship and so forth and so on. But looking at this from the perspective of somebody who has worked on the Cold War and, Cold War in Asia, I don't think there's grounds to believe that whatever the new relationship is between Russia and North Korea, that this friendship will be very durable and long-lasting. So thank you very much again. Apologies for my misbehaving dog. I have her under a little better control now, but I will end there.
Thank you, Greg. That historical perspective is really helpful. And now I'll turn to our second speaker, who is Jenny Town. She is a senior fellow at the Stimson Center and director of Stimson's 38 North program. Her expertise is North Korea, U.S. DPRK relations, U.S. Republic of Korea Alliance, and Northeast Asia regional security. She was named one of Worth Magazine's Groundbreakers 2020, 50 Women Changing the World, and one of Fast Company's most creative people in business in 2019 for her role in co-founding and managing the 38 North website. The website provides policy and technical analysis on North Korea. Ms. Town is also an expert reviewer for Freedom House's Freedom in the World Index, and she previously worked on the Human Rights in North Korea project there. She's an associate fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She's a member of the National Committee on North Korea and an associate member of the Council of Korean Americans. She serves on the editorial board for Inkstick, an online foreign policy journal for emerging scholars. Jenny?
Well, thanks, Elise, and thanks to Harriman and Weatherhead Institutes for the invitation. As a SEPA grad, I'm always pleased to be invited to events at Columbia, and it's good to see everyone here. Also, thanks to Greg for his look back at the historical context of North Korea's triangulation among the big powers and the mistrust that really does characterize those relations. I wholly agree with the notion that the sustainability of Russia-DPRK relations as they exist today is probably very limited, and that it is absolutely likely to change when the geostrategic winds shift. And that said, I would like to look a little bit more about how Russia's war in Ukraine has really impacted the Korean Peninsula, both North and South. And of course, starting with North Korea, this is the most obvious and most watched relationship right now, this increasing cooperation between Russia and North Korea. And this has stayed very much in the political realm. At the beginning of the war, you had, Kim Jong-un was one of the first leaders to both publicly and consistently offer political support to Russia for the war that they started. But also, for the first time, offering also material support. And I think that raised a lot of questions as to where the relationship was really headed, how deep it was really going. And I think the summit, this stayed very much in the political realm until about last year, when there started to be evidence of North Korea provision of ammunition and small arms to Russia, as rumors of a Russian arms deal or a North Korean arms deal to Russia were leaked. And I think, all of those questions about whether they really meant it, whether the North Koreans meant it, whether the Russians would really want it, all of those questions were really put to rest at the summit between Kim Jong-un and Putin at the Vysotny Cosmodrome last year, which really marked a turning point in relations between the two countries. So, this idea that, Kim Jong-un, I think it was very clear that Kim Jong-un was willing to provide material support and very much saw an opportunity of what it could get from Russia in that process. And while there are many questions about how far Russia is willing to go and provide in return, I think it became clear that both sides saw very much mutual benefit in the relationship, despite sanctions, despite international law, despite protest from the international community. Again, as both countries, their pariah status began to grow. This really pushed them together towards common geostrategic goals. I think for the Russian side, what do they get out of this? And I know there was a lot of early skepticism of why they would want North Korean weapons to begin with. The quality wasn't seen as, what Russia was used to or what they would have liked. But at the end of the day, it's still munitions, and there is a war effort going on. And it was a way to help supplement their own munitions and arms and small arms. And in a way to replenish their stocks, give them strategic advantage in the battlefield out of sheer numbers and sheer volume of weaponry. But I think this is, Russia's incentives here now go beyond just the war in Ukraine. And I think what you see more and more is the narrative about Russia's war against the West. How do you undermine a US-led or Western-led international order? And I think, when you have, institutions, for instance, like the BRICS, who just added 5 new members, This is seen a lot as an alternative to the Western led order in the international economic sphere. And I think the way that Russia is viewing North Korea these days is very much having now a military partner in that effort, in that war against the West as well. And certainly, Russia-China relations, they've talked about a no-limit friendship. But at the end of the day, China has not necessarily openly discouraged Russia-North Korea relations from growing. But they have not always been super in favor of what Russia is doing either. They have not been unwavering in their political support for Russia's war. And they have, they are not willing to openly talk about military support to Russia as well for the war efforts, whereas North Korea is. And so at the end of the day, North Korea becomes a military partner who is nuclear armed, who is willing to do all of those things, provide political and military support to Russia's efforts. And that is now being rewarded. And so for North Korea, what they get out of it, of course, cooperation has come in the form of trade and agricultural cooperation, medical cooperation, cultural, sports, and tourism has resumed between the two countries. There's lots of rumors about the re-influx of North Korean overseas workers going to Russia. So bringing a lot of economic and sociocultural benefits. And as well as, these are tangible and immediate benefits that are a big win for Kim Jong-un as he emerges from the hardships of the self-isolation that came during the pandemic period. But what he's getting for the first time now that no one else has been willing to, offer in the past is, of course, the military cooperation. And this means hardware like fighter jets, selling fighter jets and other hardware in the conventional realm to North Korea. But, the idea that they had the summit at the Space Center to begin with, Russia has openly talked about a willingness to assist on satellite and space-oriented technologies. And the concern is, of course, that they're doing much more, such as offering technical assistance on ballistic missiles, nuclear submarines, perhaps even nuclear reactors as North Korea tries to get its experimental light water reactor running, or even nuclear weapons. So one of the notable changes, though, that we've seen in North Korea because of this shift is really a shift of resources domestically as well into its military industry. So, while a lot of the North Korean public narrative really does still talk about the need to raise living standards in North Korea, especially in the rural areas, and the need to improve agriculture because there was great food insecurity during especially the end of the pandemic period, there is now a lot of talk too about military industry as part of that economic development that we did not see prior to 2020. And the ability for North Korea to really shift resources into the military industry also creates, presumably is to help continue providing arms and munitions and potentially missiles, as we've seen in the battlefield, to Russia. But as conflict spreads into the Middle East, it also brings up a lot of questions of what North Korea might be willing to do there and who, again, might want and see value in North Korean weapons, as there has been a history of North Korean provision of sale of arms to Iran and to Iran-backed militias such as Hamas and Hezbollah. So this is, potentially a very lucrative moment for Kim Jong-un, and again, really creates a lot of big wins and helps embolden him as he emerges strong from the pandemic. And so while North Korea has been enormously successful in developing its WMD capabilities through its own means, especially since Kim Jong-un has come to power, Russian assistance in these areas could certainly help improve, refine, accelerate further progress on these asymmetric capabilities, and certainly posing a more credible threat to the United States and its allies in the region, and calling into question U.S. extended deterrence in the region as well. As we look at south of the DMZ, the South Korean responses to the war, in the early days, South Korea was much more hesitant to get on board with like sanctions over Russia because of their own economic ties to Russia and their own trade relations with Russia. But as South Korea has also really leaned into deepening the alliance with the United States, as well as trilateral alliance cooperation with the US and Japan and South Korea, this sort of investment in and value signaling has really put South Korea firmly in the camp against Russia. They have signed on to sanctions. They have spoken out against it. And I do think there's still some vested interest in South Korea to help Ukraine as a way to sort of pay back the goodwill that was shown towards Korea during the war from the international community to help South Korea during the Korean War as well. So, while on some level it's, the war in Ukraine is far removed geographically from the Korean Peninsula, as the war goes on, I think more and more it has become very much a Korea security issue, with now South Korean weapons provision to Poland in order to provide to the Ukrainians. So you have South Korean weapons on the Ukrainian side of the battlefield, you have North Korean weapons on the Russian side of the battlefield, and the stakes, increasing security stakes in both Koreas for the outcome of the war. I do think there's, one of the things, though, beyond just the relationship itself, that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has really brought to light, both to South Korea as well as in the region more broadly, is the idea that nuclear weapons could actually be used. And I think, prior to this war, there was a general sense of the nuclear taboo, right? Like, we have nuclear weapons, but the idea of actually using nuclear weapons in a nuclear war, especially against a non-nuclear armed state, was very much taboo, was very much sort of out of fashion, out of date. And what the war in Russia has done, or war in Ukraine has done, is really bring that back as a real possibility. Not only nuclear weapons use itself, but the idea that they've been, that the Russians first went after Chernobyl and then went after Zaporizhzhia in the nuclear power plants, and how that now plays into the battlefield on the ground in modern warfare. The idea too that, the way that the Russians have fought the war, all of the international norms that have been broken in the process, all of the international laws and humanitarian laws that have been broken in the process, are now only being amplified and exacerbated in the war in Gaza. And this really then brings to question a lot of how war might look, in how future wars might look. And what are states like North Korea learning from Russia's actions in Ukraine? Will this make North Korea more likely to initiate their own kind of territorial expansionary war over South Korea in the future? Will they be more emboldened to threaten to use nuclear weapons, which I think we've already seen in their nuclear rhetoric since the war started in Ukraine? And a lot of fears as well about what happens in case of a multi-front conflict, where what if there is still war going on in Ukraine? What if there is a war, a contingency that happens over Taiwan or the South China Seas? When countries like South Korea have combined forces with the United States, this, calls into question how resources will be allocated in the defense of multiple fronts. and again, calls into question, the actual willingness to use nuclear weapons in the future. We've seen obviously great hesitation in the war in Ukraine, and while that might be that might be a good thing to many of us. I do think there's questions in South Korea, especially, of if North Korea were to use nuclear weapons or threaten to use nuclear weapons, how willing would the US be willing to respond with nuclear weapons as well? And so these kinds of debates have really grown into and really uncovered a lot of insecurity in South Korea, which has now taken the form of, a real public mainstream debate about whether South Korea needs its own nuclear weapons. And do you need nuclear weapons to deter nuclear weapons use? So I think, a lot of what South Korea is going through in this process, and a lot of the anxieties that are coming out, are reflected in broader relations in Northeast Asia. And these are all worrying trends in the region, especially when there are currently no formal and very few informal diplomatic channels active, especially between the US and North Korea, or even between the two Koreas. So if something were to happen, the idea of crisis communications and misperception, the potential for misperceptions and miscalculations is very high. Moreover, in terms of the broader region, if you're looking at, the real doubling down on value sharing policies, this really is hardening the trend towards this reformation of Cold War alignments, making it much more difficult to reach across ideological lines and to find issues to work on together, and finding it in mutual interest to work together. This is becoming harder as greater insecurity is driving further arms racing, which then is driving further insecurity, and so forth. So therefore, I do think how the war in Ukraine ends could have a very significant impact on these geopolitical trends and the relationships like Russia and North Korea. And it's something that it's very hard to predict at this point what that looks like, but will be very significant.
Thank you, Jenny, for that very sobering ending to your presentation. And now we will turn to Elizabeth Wishnick, who is Senior Research Scientist in the China and Indo-Pacific Security Affairs Division at the Center for Naval Analysis, CNA. She's on leave from her position as Professor of Political Science at Montclair State University. Since 2002, she's been a research scholar at Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University. And she previously taught undergraduate and graduate courses in international relations, Chinese politics, and Chinese foreign policy here at Columbia, also at Barnard College, and at SIPA, School of International and Public Affairs here. Dr. Wishnick has dual regional expertise on China and Russia, and is an expert on Chinese foreign policy, Sino-Russian relations, Northeast Asian and Central Asian security, and Arctic geopolitics. Her new book, China's Risk, Energy, Water, Food, and Regional Security, is forthcoming with Columbia University Press. And it addresses the security consequences of energy, water, and food risks in China for its Eurasian neighbors. This is also a topic she explores in her policy blog, www.chinaresourcesrisks.com. Dr. Wishnick received her PhD in political science from Columbia, and an MA in Russian and East European Studies from Yale University, and a BA from Barnard College. She speaks Mandarin, Russian, and French. Elizabeth?
Thank you, Elise, Eileen, the Harriman Institute, and the Weatherhead East Asian Institute. It's a pleasure to talk about this important topic with you today. So a lot has been said already, and I'm going to add to the mix by focusing on China's view. I'm going to start out with a bit of background on the current state or the recent state of China, North Korea relations. And then I'm going to focus on the question that some in the policy community have raised of late. Is there a China-North Korea axis? And I'm going to argue that the prospect of such an axis and even closer Russia-North Korea ties poses a problem for China. So first, a bit of background. China and North Korea share an 870-mile border. And this is important because it tells us about the kind of risks that China feels from developments in North Korea, especially the prospect of instability there, economic crisis that could lead to a massive outflow of refugees into China, where there is a Korean Chinese population, an ethnic Korean province adjacent. I visited this area and the Tumen River border area, and it's very striking for two reasons. One is that the Tumen River is rather narrow, very easily you could cross it, except for the North Korean border guards aiming rifles at you. And if you compare the development on either side, China's even in the relatively undeveloped Northeast provinces is in a different economic reality than North Korea across the river, where you see just about nothing. So they do share a boundary. They had an alliance treaty in 1961. They signed this alliance treaty, but there's some question whether China would actually come to North Korea's defense in the case of a conflict today. This being said, North Korea is highly dependent on China. 90% of its trade is with China. It includes imports of energy and food and exports of coal and fish. Bilateral trade fell during COVID because of border closures, but has largely recovered between the two countries. North Korea, however, is not part of the Belt and Road Initiative, although it has been a part of the Tumen River Development Program, which is a UNDP-affiliated multilateral program that includes Russia, South Korea, and Mongolia in addition. And Russia has had its own infrastructure and transit initiative for the Korean Peninsula, which sanctions, of course, have disrupted. Russia has long dreamed of some kind of energy corridor connecting the Korean Peninsula to Eastern Russia. China has largely abided by UN sanctions against North Korea for its various military activities. There is some evidence of circumvention in certain respects, but China has been seen as a key part of the solution, any diplomatic solution to tensions on the Korean Peninsula. So this gives us a little context into which I'm going to now turn to the issue of the potential for a China-Russia-North Korea axis. So this idea comes to mind because of the deepening China-Russia partnership. It's been called a no-limits partnership, but actually since mid-2023, the two countries have moved away from this formulation because they see that it raises a lot more questions in the international community, and they feel that it puts more pressure on them to justify their joint activities. But this being said, the two have a deepening partnership. I would call it an alignment rather than an alliance. And this relationship in the Indo-Pacific has become closer than it used to be, although they agree to disagree on a number of questions in that part of the world. Of late, they've both been concerned about what they call the NATOization of the Asia-Pacific, meaning the closer ties between NATO and U.S. Indo-Pacific allies that has ensued from the Russian war in Ukraine. And also Russia-China relations have tightened in Asia because of the closer U.S. alliances with our Indo-Pacific partners. So this is the background where this question is raised. You have, on the one hand, the deepening China-Russia partnership, and they're looking out in the region and seeing closer ties between the US and its allies in the Pacific and between European and Asian allies. So what is the evidence for this idea of an axis? So you did see Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu proposing trilateral military exercises in September. So these haven't happened yet, and they might just be of a performative nature, much as we saw China, Russia, Iran exercises recently, but still raises the specter of some kind of a trilateral military relationship going on there. In recent years, Russia and China have voted together at the UN against new sanctions on North Korea. And this was a big departure because previously they had largely voted, or at least not obstructed, the international community in imposing sanctions. And so this happened in May of 2022 and also May and August of 2023 in response to North Korean ballistic missile launches and spy satellite launches. And then you have the issue of North Korean military aid to Russia that we've been discussing. And so it has some implications for China as well, where we could see some kind of division of labor working out where China doesn't directly support Russian militarily, but North Korea, which is China's partner, is doing the dirty work, so to speak, while China contributes with dual-use items. So it's the greatest contributor of these items to the Russian war effort. Even though it's not a direct supply to the Russian military, there's certainly a wide range of products that support the Russian military that come from China, from Chinese companies, from Russians buying them in China, and so forth. And so it takes some pressure off of China to do more for Russia, its strategic partner, by having North Korea provide the military aid. And then it also distracts from what China sees as increasing Western pressure on China. So if North Korea is suddenly in the news again, acting out by testing and sending arms to Russia, by comparison, there's less attention perhaps on China. That's at least a hope. I think we have a good attention span, so we've been paying attention to a lot of different activities, but that's one possible way in which there's some kind of perception of coordination among the three. And despite all of this, I would argue that closer ties between Russia and North Korea actually pose some problems for China. As Jenny was mentioning, in terms of the repercussions, the geopolitical repercussions in the neighborhood, a tighter Russia-North Korea partnership could deepen U.S. bilateral relations with Japan and South Korea, intensify trilateralism to help remove some of the obstacles to trilateralism, or even spur a regional arms race. As Jenny mentioned, the consideration of nuclear weapons in South Korea is quite alarming for China, which does not want to have a nuclear arms race. Potentially even Japan might consider itself at risk in this kind of situation. Also, if China is seen as being a part of a trilateral axis with Russia and North Korea, this creates an image problem for China, which already has one because of Ukraine. It's seen as a tacit supporter of Russia in Ukraine, undermining the European security architecture. And if China is seen as also undermining norms against nuclear proliferation and weapons proliferation sanctions in the Indo-Pacific, that's also puts China in a very negative light. But China's in a tough spot because China does not like to be held responsible for North Korea's bad behavior. So despite the 1961 alliance, they they can't control North Korea, even despite having 90% of the trade with North Korea, it still can't control North Korea. And that's, yeah, and other countries, I think, perhaps unfairly outsource the North Korean problem to China, thinking that China can do more than it can. But certainly it could apply some economic pressure, but North Korea is fairly resistant to such pressures. On the other hand, China also doesn't like it when other countries like Russia or the US even take the lead with North Korea. So we saw this with Trump's diplomacy. Even though it wasn't successful, China was still a little bit back-footed by it, being used to being asked to take the lead on North Korea. And now you see Russia ahead of China in many ways. And although China has no doubt a lot of intelligence in North Korea, still you have to wonder what Lavrov and Wang Yi were talking about when they met recently with respect to North Korea. Also, trilateralism, some kind of axis between Russia, China, and North Korea could impact China's ties with South Korea. And these are economically very important to China. South Korea is China's number one economic partner in Asia, if you don't count ASEAN, and after ASEAN. And it also, ties to South Korea are very integral to China's efforts to split the alliance between the US and South Korea. So for all these reasons, I think China's not ecstatic about the turn of events between Russia and North Korea. I've been reading some of the Chinese expert literature about this, and some of them, there's not a lot. So censorship is tighter on foreign affairs writing in China nowadays. I haven't found a lot on this yet, but what I did find shows some doubt about Russia's ability to achieve its aims in North Korea. Some authors mention that Russia has a relatively low volume of trade with North Korea, and it'd be very difficult to increase it, and that sanctions would constrain their cooperation further, including in labor. And labor is an area that Russia's probably interested in, because they did abide by sanctions more or less in terms of contracts with North Korean construction workers and farm labor. But this was an area where in Eastern Russia, at least, North Korea was very welcome, because they were skeptical about Chinese laborers and much more welcoming of North Korean laborers, who were monitored very closely. Their passports were usually taken away. They couldn't illegally take up residence in Russia very easily. And people valued their work. I had colleagues who would hire North Korean workers on the side to renovate their bathrooms, for example. So North Koreans were fully a part of the regional economy, at least in Eastern Russia. And finally, Chinese experts talk about how unclear it is how and whether Russia will reward North Korean military cooperation. So North Korea might want a lot of technical expertise and perhaps weapons from Russia, but there are a lot of constraints on Russia's military production right now. They're struggling to keep the production levels up to produce the equipment they need for Ukraine. And so I think Russian exports of weapons and military assistance are going to be constrained because of that. So North Korea might be disappointed in some of the things, some of the asks that it has. Chinese experts also mentioned that China-Russia relations might be a stabilizing factor in terms of the relationship between North Korea and Russia, in the sense that China should be involved more, so that China should take a role in kind of steering them in the right direction, so to speak. On the other hand, Chinese experts point out that the rhetoric in North Korea on a neo-Cold War that Kim Jong-un raises runs counter to Xi Jinping's global security initiative. So China keeps saying that it does not want a new Cold War. It's the US wants a Cold War. But then there's Kim Jong-un talking about new Cold Wars. So that's kind of a problem for China rhetorically if it's trying to create a new vision of an interdependent security community with China at the helm, and then you have North Korea and Russia creating a kind of bloc-like impression that creates some dissonance. So for all these reasons, I think, although China might derive certain benefits from closer Russia-North Korea cooperation, in terms of reducing some pressure on China, perhaps, I think Chinese experts certainly see a lot of negatives there. And I think we're going to see how China navigates this new situation, how, whether or not the new Russia-North Korea dynamic is going to impact the China-Russia relationship in any way, or whether China is going to succeed in managing its relations with Russia on the one hand and with North Korea on the other. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Well, this is why we have these panels, because each of the many factors brought up by our speakers helps us to go beyond the headlines or beyond the kind of general impressions of what even Russia observers might think is happening with Russia's so-called, turn toward a new military relationship with North Korea. And you all suggested some of the ways in which the past, the history, and current issues, maybe impede or at least slow down that relationship. And then this larger relationship with China and the trilateral relationship, as Elizabeth has been pointing out, also is maybe not what it seems from the outside or from a superficial reading of headlines. So thank you for that. And this is why we have experts. And so this has really been illuminating and quite interesting. So if people have questions or comments that they want to share, again, please, if you're joining us in the webinar, please put your question in the question and answer box. And if you are joining us on YouTube, you can put your question in the chat and we will get to it. So I would like to, encourage our panelists to ask or comment on each other's presentations. And I will just say, it's really just a few things that I've noticed that struck me as really interesting is, Greg, you brought up historically the kind of cultural differences as an impediment to close Russian-North Korean relations. And then Jenny, you brought up one of the new aspects of this closer ties has been the kind of encouragement of flows between peoples in North Korea and Russia. And Elizabeth, you mentioned this as well. And I apropos of bringing Russian tourists to North Korea, I will say that I saw a video of a Russian television personality in North Korea, kind of encouraging Russians to visit North Korea, and streets were empty and it looked, pretty, stopped and interviewed a few North Koreans, but it didn't really look like the kind of place, knowing Russian tourists, that they would jump at the chance to visit. So that struck me as a clear example of the kind of impediment to the people-to-people relations. But if you could talk anything about that, or about actually this very interesting question of migrants in terms of North Korean economic migrants going to Russia. Nobody mentioned actually discriminatory attitudes toward Asian peoples that exist among some quarters in Russia. So I don't know if that's something, at the mass level that is just ignored in relations with Russia because of the economic needs there, or if that's, in your view, also could feed into into kind of slowing down a close rapprochement. So that's a kind of human bias or human factor, if anyone wants to comment about that. And switching gears, I just wanted to ask maybe Jenny about missiles, Korean missiles. Is this really a chance for Korea's war and the selling of Korean missiles something that's happening? We're giving, as part of these military packages, giving Korean missiles to Russia. And is this a chance for Korea to really observe their use in Ukraine? Is that something that's happening thus far? And this would be another really concrete example of maybe emboldening Korea as an actor regionally, or just the war presenting an opportunity to see how its military equipment works. And do you observe any of that in your study of what's happening in North Korea? And is that something that you think could lead to an emboldened or more assertive North Korea, at least regionally?
I have sort of a couple of comments on some of the cultural, you brought up the cultural differences, and the point I was I think trying to make is that North Korea and China, although there's certainly a lot of cultural distinctiveness between the two, there's also a lot that they share. And some people would point to the fact that the relationship goes back many centuries. Now, I think North Korea and China since 1949 have tended to say, well, now the relationship is based on socialism, but there's still a lot of commonalities. And I think one thing that people have commented on with Xi Jinping returning to the kind of cult of personality politics is that he's actually making China more like North Korea in certain regards. And so I think that's a reason why China and North Korea have always tended to remain more closely aligned, and if Russia eclipsed China temporarily as North Korea's closest partner, North Korea always sort of swings back to be closer to China eventually. And I think, the other speakers pointed to some very interesting dynamics about the current relationship, and, what if China and Russia get too close? Is that good or bad for China? The other point I would make, I think you were, I think you were quite accurate when you suggest that these, cultural flows and migrants, they don't always improve relations. It certainly wasn't the case historically. I mean, sometimes they do, but sometimes, North Koreans can travel to Russia. And, I mean, a lot of times when North Koreans go to study in the few countries that they have relations with, a lot of times they're completely isolated and not allowed to interact very much. So it's not like, you have more North Koreans going to study in Russia and they're going to come back with some deep appreciation for Russian culture. At least that's my perception of it. So I think, I think that was a very, interesting point about, how cultural similarities and differences affect this and are going to continue to affect this.
Yeah, I'll just continue on that point. I think that the migration issue is very interesting, because the North Koreans, I think, are more welcomed in Eastern Russia because they are so controlled. They usually, the workers are on government, local government contracts. There are fixed numbers of them. There's a North Korean overseer who holds the passports. So they're there for a fixed amount of time, and they do a specific task, which is usually construction or agricultural work. So there's not the same concern among the Russian population that while they need migrant labor, because they have a very tiny population in Eastern Russia, it's 2/3 of the size of the United States and the Russian Far East, and they have less than 10 million people. So they need labor, but they fear being overrun by Chinese labor. And so they've been reluctant to hire more Chinese labor over the years and set more stringent restrictions on their activity. So I think North Koreans benefit by that. I mean, now there was a move to encourage former citizens from other parts of former Soviet Union, like Central Asia, to move to Eastern Russia, but there's a lot of discrimination against them too. Uzbekistani taxi drivers are looked down on in Vladivostok and so on. But I would say in Vladivostok, at least, when I used to go there, you would see North Koreans as academics, in Russian institutions. I remember staying in a kind of hostel, and there were North Koreans in the kitchen. so I mean, they did manage to have some autonomy there, although there weren't very many of them. But I think COVID ended a lot of this, and as well as the sanctions on North Korean labor. So we'll have to see whether Russia's going to be violating these sanctions and using more of the labor in the future.
I just want to make a couple of points. One is, when you're talking about North Korean workers in Russia, they're not migrants, they're contract workers. They're there with the permission of the government on a contract with either a company or, some kind of local provincial government or something in Russia. So it isn't just a migration of North Koreans looking for work in Russia. And that is the difference, again, between North Korean labor versus like Chinese labor. You're not going to get masses of them going in because that's not how the North Korean system works. And when they come in on contract labor, they're actually pretty well received because, North Korean labor tends to be educated and highly skilled, as well as cheap and hardworking and controlled, if they're on these contracts, especially. There are other instances of, in some of the border areas in Vladivostok, in Novosibirsk, there are North Korean business people there that can act like real business people. So not every North Korean in Russia is a contract laborer. So in some of those, those Siberian cities, for instance, there are North Koreans that do business, that do act like, they can kind of operate as if they were, for instance, a Chinese businessman, but they've been there long enough to do it. Those that go on, student visas, for instance, it really kind of depends on the relationships that they have with those universities as to how much freedom and socioeconomic space they have, how closely they're watched. Some of it depends on, which university, which city, all of those things. So the experience can really vary. And the idea of, will Russia violate sanctions and bring, North Korean workers back to Russia because that were banned, under UN sanctions? Absolutely. I don't think there's any question as to whether they will. The question is, I think, how many are they willing to do? And we've seen the Chinese do this as well, where, there's also oftentimes they'll have a very broad interpretation of sanctions where, instead of issuing work visas, they'll issue student visas or friendship visas or different ways to get around sanctions. But I think it's pretty clear these days, especially with Putin gifting Kim Jong-un a luxury car, that sanctions are not top of mind for Russia at the moment, and that there's a lot that they're willing to do regardless of international law. I think on some of the questions about the how to characterize, especially Russia and North Korea, I specifically avoid the word alliance because it is not alliance. I do think partnership, cooperation, these kinds of understandings are better, are more accurate. This is not a formal military alliance. There's, I don't think there's much expectation that it will last beyond, again, this geostrategic moment. And if those goals are met, how Russian goals are met will really, I think, characterize what opportunity there is for the North Koreans in the future. And if that opportunity starts to dwindle, North Korean attention will also turn. So while, North Korea talks now about Russia being its top priority, priorities can change and will change with the moment. When it comes to North Korean missiles, what has been found in the battlefields in Ukraine, absolutely, North Korea gets to finally see some performance diagnostics, right? So like, because of all the restrictions on North Koreans' weapons development to begin with, the testing regime has been minimal of what you would want as a weapons developer. You would want multiple tests of each system to see how it works, how it performs. And they've never had that ability, right? They usually do 1 or 2 tests just to make sure it gets in the air, and call it a day, put it out for deployment, but have no experience with actual battlefield performance. And so this is something that they get to now do by providing missiles to Russia, and the Russians are using them. So there is some sense of how they work, and what they might need to improve in the future. It also gives us finally some idea of how the missiles are made, right? There was the recent report that noted, in their guidance system that there was, I think it was like over 100 components that were foreign sourced from a number of different countries. So despite sanctions, North Korea is still getting the procurements that they need in order to build the missiles that they want to build, and the weaponry that they want to build. I think there's also, does this lead to more emboldened North Korea? I think all of this leads to a more emboldened North Korea. Again, the economic cooperation, while it might not be what it can get from China, the needs are great, and every little bit helps. And the results are immediate, they're tangible. And on top of that, Kim Jong-un is basically playing big power politics at the moment. He's meeting with Putin, he's potentially meeting with Xi Jinping later. So it's like for who North Korea is, their worldview has really changed, right? And their position in the world has really changed. They really do see themselves as an outsized power to what they should be. And that absolutely emboldens Kim Jong-un. And so, this is what, for instance, in South Korea and in the US-Korea alliance and US-Korea-Japan cooperation, this is a worrisome trend of, again, as they're learning, what actual strategies, what tactics, what rhetoric, what doctrine are they learning from the Russians, or even from the Chinese and Chinese behavior in South China Seas. One of the things that we're watching now is, North Korea has announced that it's been studying the constitutions of other countries, and soon in its next SPA meeting wants to define its national borders. It has recently said it's given up on peaceful reunification. It declared itself an independent sovereign state. It's no longer North Korea, it is the DPRK. And there's always been disputes over, for instance, the Northern Limit Line. And so North Korea has now said, okay, well, we are going to define what our boundaries are, even in the maritime realm. And there's a lot of concerns about, if that doesn't match the Northern Limit Line, how much will it be off? What kind of liberties will North Korea take in that? And then what kind of problems will that create in inter-Korean relations and territorial disputes going forward, adding to the historical territorial disputes that already exist? So there are a lot of really worrisome trends here to follow, that, again, that Russia's position and Russia's strategic calculus at the moment is really kind of fueling.
Yeah, your comments really suggest how much Russia has recently, as a result of this war, become a revisionist power, insofar as it's strengthening its relationship with revisionist or North Korea, but also allowing all of these dangers, as you note, to come forward in the international system. And it's really, really, surprising. Well, maybe not surprising to specialists on international relations, but to the more casual observer, that a small country can have so much influence in constraining large powers like China and frightening the rest of the rest of the region, the states in the region and outside the region as well. So I want to give an opportunity to other speakers, our speakers, to comment on any point that you want to, anything that you heard another of our guests make, or any other point that you want to mention as a result of this very interesting discussion.
Well, I wanted to come back to Greg's point about how Xi Jinping makes China more like North Korea. I think that's a great observation, but probably not one very welcome in Beijing. So I think that's kind of the conundrum for China, is that they want to have a relationship with North Korea that maintains its stability, but that doesn't have blowback for China in terms of, we were talking about migrants. I mean, the real migrants are the North Korean migrants to China, and that's a problem for China politically, that it does not fully control that border necessarily. It wants to make sure that this flow of population is reduced and put under control. And then it wants to be able to control the parameters in the neighborhood. So if North Korea has this Russian outlet now where it can potentially get access to technologies that will change the regional balance of power in a direction that is disadvantageous for China, that's very problematic. And so it is the small state dilemma, where you have the small, weak, much weaker state that has the potential to create a whole new security situation that is very unfavorable. But this comes in a context where it's all of China's friends that are engaged in this behavior, and so it puts China in a bind about how to respond, because it's supposed to be in partnership with Russia. They have regular Northeast Asia security dialogues. It's supposed to be an ally of North Korea, and so how do you constrain your partners to act in a way that they see counter to their own interests?
Yeah, I actually also wanted to follow, a couple of things. I mean, I think, absolutely. I think, the perception that China wants isn't that it's becoming more like North Korea necessarily, but I think, I do think that when, China moves in the direction that it's been moving in, that it does tend to create more, sort of commonalities between the two, and makes it easier for them to get along and work together. I found a couple of other points interesting. I think one is that Kim Jong-un and North Korea is gaining a lot of international attention and prestige as a result of this new interaction with Russia. And I think the future of talks between South Korea and North Korea, or a new round of talks between North Korea and the United States, wasn't looking very bright as it was. But the main attraction of those kinds of talks, or one of the attractions of those kinds of talks for the Kim regime, was the attention and the international prestige, and Kim Jong-un being able to get up there as sort of an international statesman. So now if he's getting that from the relationship with Russia, it seems there's even less likelihood that North Korea will come back to the negotiating table. And I think, right now it looks like a very, very distant prospect, but I do think it's important to realize that Russia is probably, right now making it worse, and Russia may live to regret that in the long term. I had also a quick question for Jenny that I was sort of interested in. She talked about the foreign sourced components of North Korea's weapons. And I was sort of curious about what the North Korea's main suppliers were. I mean, I would tend to guess China, But I'm wondering if, if there's any others, or it seems, maybe China's not the main supplier, but I'm really curious as to what the major suppliers are.
So there was a report put out by the Conflict Armament Research Institute, CAR, recently that was looking at one of the missiles that was recovered in Ukraine, one of the North Korean missiles recovered in Ukraine, and especially in their guidance systems. Like I said, there was over 100 components that were foreign manufactured components that were coming from all over the world. A lot of European components, a lot of some US components, some, from other countries. Whether they got them through China or not is unclear. You can't tell. But a lot of those components are available on the open market. They're not specialty components. They're things that you could probably order off of Amazon because they're not necessarily, missile specific either. And so, it just goes to show though that, the North Koreans are incredibly resourceful in their procurements and their ability to gain goods. And there's definitely people out there working with them and willing to work with them. And it's been heavily documented in a lot of the sanctions evasion research that's been done both in open sources and through, for instance, the panel of experts, which was just dissolved, whose mandate will end at the end of the month due to Russia's veto. Of which implicated a lot of Russian companies as well, and a lot of obviously arms sales and trade and between Russia and North Korea in the process. So this is going to be once those there's a fear that like now that body is being dissolved and there's less formal attention in the international community on sanctions, monitoring sanctions evasion, and sanctions implementation, that the regime is getting weaker. The sanctions regime is getting weaker and weaker. But if you don't have Russian support and implementation of sanctions or Chinese, strict support or implementation of sanctions, the sanctions regime was already getting weaker. So, it is one of those situations where the mandate of the 1718 committee is still intact and is still meant to monitor implementation of sanctions against North Korea. The panel of experts was obviously helping provide information into that effort and helping investigate that. In and of itself, that doesn't necessarily weaken the sanctions regime, but it certainly is a bellwether of the trends of where this is going. And Russia's willingness to support North Korea politically while benefiting from that support for its own purposes.
Thank you. This is, I think, unless there's any final comments from our speakers, I want to really thank each of you for providing a deep and sobering and, if not frightening, perspective on recent developments. And this is again why we have these panels and serves as a resource, for our students and for the wider community going forward. So I really want to thank you for participating and for the broad number of subjects and perspectives that you presented. And I also want to just take a moment to say that this panel was made possible because Harriman Institute has a grant from Carnegie Foundation that funds the program on U.S.-Russian relations. So I would like to thank Carnegie for today's event, as well as Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University and Eileen Hoon for her excellent organizational skills. Thanks to our audience for attending. And again, really grateful to each of you for lending your expertise today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Elise. Bye-bye.